What systems in your school actually help students learn from mistakes, and which ones simply move the problem elsewhere? Thanks for joining me on this episode of Shifting Schools. I'm your host, Jeff Utecht, and today we're diving deep into the real work of restorative justice in schools with Nicholas Bradford, founder and director of the National Center for Restorative Justice. You'll hear how restorative practices go far beyond empathy. They create systems of accountability that preserve relationships while addressing real harm. Nicholas walks us through how his center builds capacity in schools through hands-on training and why middle and high school in particular are ripe for the transformation. We also explore the current challenges school leaders face, from the rise of chronic absenteeism to the thorny question around creating phone-free schools and how restorative frameworks can be part of that solution. Nicholas Bradford is a former classroom teacher turned youth advocate and policy analyst. His 2016, he founded the National Center for Restorative Justice to support educators in making schools more equitable, empathetic, and effective. The center runs 3-day in-person trainings, offers virtual learning, and provides hands-on consultants to help schools implement restorative justice practices that stick. Nicholas is also the author of A Real-World Guide to Restorative Justice in Schools and a leading voice in how restorative practices intersect with educational leadership, student engagement, and trauma-informed pedagogy. Before we get to today's episode, just a quick reminder, if you are a school leader or interested in becoming one, we have a new newsletter out just for you called the AI Forward K-12 Leadership Brief. Each issue delivers best practices, case studies, policy updates, and hands-on strategies to keep your school ahead of the curve. You can subscribe now and join a growing network of forward-thinking leaders by clicking the link in the show notes or signing up at shiftingschools.com. Thank you for joining us for another episode of Shifting Schools. Now enjoy this episode with Nicholas from the National Center of Restorative Justice. All right, welcome back to another episode of Shifting Schools. So excited today to be here with Nicholas Bradford, who's the founder and director that works for the National Center of Restorative Justice. Nicholas, thank you so much for being on the podcast today. I want to start with a little introduction from you, your background, and what made this idea to found and start the National Center for Restorative Justice.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. Pleasure to be here. So in 2009, I was a classroom teacher and I was exposed. Before I had kids, I had a lot more time on my hands. So I was doing some volunteering in the evenings and got connected with a community organization in Vermont that was doing RJ work with kids who had charges, either pre-citation or direct referrals from police. And so I just got a little basic couple evenings of training and sat in with young people who were really trying to grapple with some of the naughty things that they've done, whatever we want to say that. And I found it really interesting. So in my day job when I was teaching, I worked with young kids who were in behavioral programs. So kids who had gotten into a couple fights, some arson, some threats and things like that. Some they were just not being successful in that comprehensive high school. And I think this experience for a lot of folks who work in the alternative education space, which is we don't actually grapple with the issues or the challenges that brought kids to those schools. It is a lot like if you get a district suspension or expulsion where you're moving to another district and the new district or the new high school is like, cool, hey, Nicholas, thanks for being here. Come on in. Yeah. Don't do the thing that you did at the other place. And that's so
yeah, that's true.
I found the work that we were doing in the evenings, that I was doing in the evenings was like so interesting. And like, how do I do this in schools? So that was 2009, 2012, and then 2011, 2012, I got my master's in ed policy with a focus on restorative justice, trying to apply what I'd learned there to the education space, looking at suspensions, the negative impact of suspensions, school resource officers, ticketing, and stuff like that. And then looking at the positive outcomes of restorative justice. And then I started doing this work since 2012. And then I founded the National Center in 2016. Published our book, which is a real-world guide to restorative justice in schools in 2021. And it's been trying to grind away and help schools and help teachers and principals like engage in this conflict work in a healthy, sustainable way.
Awesome. Can you maybe explain a little bit, what does that work look like for you for the Center on Restorative Justice? What does that work look like as far as teachers coming together or teams coming together, and maybe even a story of success of having the team come in and hang out with you and some ideas that they've seen come out of that?
We we ask a lot of schools. The vast majority of our engagement is in these 3-day trainings that are happening in person, Seattle, Portland, Kansas City, Chicago. That level of engagement allows educators to really bond. So typically a school will send 2, but maybe 3 to 5 adults from the building, teachers, AP, dean, counselor, instructional coach, to our location and really do a deep dive in that. And it allows us to really talk at length about what restorative justice is. And then also, I try to be practical as in the name of the book, but how do we actually do this? What's because a lot of times it's like, hey, you just be more empathetic. And you're like, what's that even mean?
Yeah.
We have an exercise like to practice empathy, to being vulnerable. Like what? And it's really interesting to see adults share like really powerful, moving stories of their own, like current lives, their past lives when they were kids or in college, some of the young people that they've worked with that have been really challenging, but also just how do you engage in accountability, like for the low level stuff. And so there's some team building amongst those staff that come, but also as a group of 25 to 30 people, that really brings people together. And then they bring that back home. Our goal is to offer folks resources to implement back at their schools. We can't be everywhere all at once. And so we just want to give enough tools to people to be like, here's the 3-day. We have another 2-day if you want to come back for more. And then here's the workbook. Here's our literature. And then here's the PowerPoints. Go forth and do it. And then consulting, obviously, with us.
Sure.
Yeah. That's the lion's share. But we do a bunch of other things too. We've got like some small workshops. We've got an online course. We've got a big conference coming up in June 26th and 27th, which will be after will already have happened by the time this comes out. But things like that's what we're trying to help educators get engaged with at sort of different levels. But
are you finding more engagement at different levels? You talked about working with alternative schools or alternative high schools. Is most of your work with middle school, high school, or do you see this as your work actually across all K-12?
It is across all K-12, but I think we bias probably toward middle school and high school.
Okay.
I think that sort of in general, if we're asking folks when we're engaging in conflict to be empathetic, it's easier, and elementary school teachers are much more capable, or it's just in the nature of the work when you're working with 7, 8, 9-year-olds.
Sure.
You're like, oh yeah, like Nicholas is learning. Benjamin is like learning how to keep his hands to himself.
Yeah.
Whereas in high school, there's a lot of, you should know this by now, right? There's a middle school where these 2 boys in 8th grade were like just slamming each other into lockers. They're messing around, they're playing. They've got to be responsive to adults and say, hey, like, you can't do that here. I get it that you want to play and you want to mess around. And so typically that kind of behavior, which was repeated, those kids would be in detention. Eventually they'd be suspended for a day or 2 or 3 because they're not listening to the redirection. And that's some of the challenges. And I'll be honest, justice does have a couple challenges. And one of it is it does take a little bit more time. We are investing in time with young people in and around that conflict space so that they can get it. Young people are typically speaking slower processors than we are as adults. We've done this on our time. We've talked to kids 1,000 times. And so it's quick for us. It's slow for that 13-year-old who's, I just want to play with my friend. This is how I play. This is how we play. We're good. Why is everybody busting my chops about this? And so slowing down those processes, it is a hard thing for us to do. And so we do have some skills or some processes that help us sometimes make it more quicker, sometimes batch some problems. So we're dealing with some things together and not all at the same time, or excuse me, at the same time, not individually. So
one of the things that we hear a lot is coming out of the pandemic that we've seen classroom management on the rise in schools. You and I, before we started recording, talked about chronic absenteeism is on the rise. Have you noticed any trends just in the work you're doing or the problems that administrators and teacher teams are bringing to these workshops and conferences that they're really trying to focus in on? Are you seeing any trends, maybe even, I don't know if there's trends across the United States or trends that are maybe in specific areas of the US that you might be seeing with the work you're doing?
I don't see, there's 2 kind of big moves that we're trying to address. And I think that you hit on one of them certainly is attendance. How do we get kids to want to be in school, especially in the sort of middle school and high school space? There's not a lot that you can do. Like, you need to be in school, but actually engage in the work. So attendance, engagement, skipping, all that stuff falls under one category. So there's absolutely schools that are seeking to do that work. I think also a big push is phone-free schools.
Yeah.
So I've been working a little bit, and we're trying to build this partnership with Yonder Pouch, or Yonder, what the Yonder Pouch is. And how do we help young people? And this is all the work I've done with the Height. Really, we're just now beginning to grapple with the fact that phones are such a developmental, like, trap, addiction, like, problem, that we actually do need to meaningfully engage in this stuff. And so I don't want to be kicking kids out of school for having their phones out, even if we have a phone-free school policy. So how do we do it? How do we deal with that? And so we have a little kind of the tension. It's a little bit different, more engaged, more active, participatory. That's the work that we're offering to some schools that are trying to think about, how do we have phone-free schools? How do we have a system that addresses that? Yeah. But then in general, I don't think that any schools are really like, we have this problem over this problem. I think you have some like really high performing schools that are like, have less fights and less drugs and less swearing and hate speech. But like, that stuff is so common across schools. And some of the work that I've done in poor kids steal stuff. It's like, actually, that's not true. Having talked to parents and kids, like, and staff, I stole a bunch of stuff when I was a teenager. It was like my brother did. We weren't rich. We were like poor, but we didn't steal things that we needed. We weren't needing for anything. It was just opportunities, not thinking it impacted anybody. And so you see across the board, like, kids really needing opportunities to learn about that stuff too. Like, it doesn't impact people. So,
yeah, I love that. Part of our conversation here with our summer series is around looking at the future of work and what that might look like, both for teachers supporting kids, and at the same time, teachers may be looking at what is their career path to look for moving forward. From your youth advocate and policy analysis standpoint, I'm guessing there are a lot of different career opportunities and pathways that support restorative justice. When you think about the future of restorative justice, what or where do you hope to see it grow? And what are maybe some entry points that teachers might have to say, you know what, this is the work that I want to do. The work that fulfills me is really supporting these kiddos who need this type of work. Where do you see this work going in the future?
Yeah, I think speaking specifically about education, there's lots to think about when you think about nationally, our industry in general. But think about specifically in schools. You mentioned TOSAs earlier when we were having a conversation. One of our colleagues, one of our consultants, was a TOSA, teacher on special assignment, doing RJ work in a school. She tells a story of like, when we first met 8 years ago, I was like, you really like this work. You're great. And you have such a great, like, sort of vibe with students who are, she was a special ed teacher doing language arts in high schools. And I was like, I don't know what's going to happen for, like, we need to make positions for this. And then it was 2 years later that the position opened up at a middle school. Wow. And so she took our 3A course. We did a little consulting with her high school already. And so she had a little bit extra, and she got right into that position and did amazing work with this middle school that she worked with for, I don't know, 5 years. And then she went back into the classroom. She still works with us, but it was a really interesting space. So I think that sort of instructional coach or TOSAs can be a really awesome space. And I'll say this as far as like the level of training that you need. And I don't think people need a master's degree in complex studies to do this work. You can really do this work well, especially if you've got if you're slow and deliberative with young people to begin with in the curricular space, then this can be an easy transition. You need some coaching and some reps, I think some at-bats to do this work well, but that's easy to do, easy to find. And then the other piece is for deans, APs, and principals, or people who are going to be principals, this work is critical for your success. I work with a lot that, 60 to 90% of their work is discipline. Right? So if we get good at doing this work, and to some degree, offloading some of this to our TOSAs some different spaces, even paraeducators who are running in-school suspension space or something like that, but we've structured it in a way, then we free up a ton of our time to do the supervision, the curriculum instruction, support, the culture building as a school, leadership, whomever, right? Like,
Yeah.
we free up that time. And I think that's a really important piece of this work is we've got to be mindful about how we're using our time. Justice can be a little bit of like a time suck. It can. Like, we're talking about running a conference for each kid, and each conference takes 30 to 45 minutes. All right. That's a lot. And I get it. We're running circles in classrooms, and circles are 20 to 45 minutes in classrooms. Like, what we have to make sure that our systems are responsive to the time constraints that we have and the level of need that our students have. And so it's not just throwing more people or not just throwing more conferences at kids, but it's actually being mindful about how we're using our time effectively. And so we've got some systems that help really empower young people to take responsibility for their actions, talk about the impact, and then engage in that responsibility taking, the work of repair, which is critical.
It's so fascinating. You're talking, and I'm thinking when I got my principal certification back in 2000, golly, what would that have been? 2005, 2006. I don't think we had any classes. And I'm just trying to think, if you are taking administrative classes now and moving into this idea of being a principal and AP, whatever that future looks like for you, I'm trying to remember if there were any courses I took that even talked about how do you interact with students in a restorative justice type of way. Everything was all focused on, here's the law, make sure you're following the law. And nothing really was about, okay, if you have a kiddo that's in this type of crisis, how are you empathetic to it? How do you understand? And I wonder if there is a gap where, I think there are a lot of principals right now, probably around my age, who probably got their principalship back in the early 2000s, that maybe this wasn't part of our training, that doing workshops with you or bringing a team to the National Center for Restorative Justice and doing this work to figure out, okay, how do I lead this work in my school? I think could be really critical right now in the moment that we find ourselves in. You and I were talking before we started recording, this idea that we're in a place right now, for better or for worse, here in the United States anyways, we're in a place right now where we feel like we have to, and I think we have to sell public ed. We're selling public education. Yeah. And I think any way that we can do that shows that we are supporting kids in these new and interesting ways, and just really trying to do everything we can to keep kids in our schools, whether it's for absenteeism or it's supporting kids who are going through trauma. I just think there's so much work here that has to be done. And I just wonder, what is the leadership level of those leading our schools and understanding some of these new techniques around restorative justice with students who might be struggling in our big box public school system?
Yeah. I think about one of the ideas that when we talk about restorative justice, we think about this definition, which is it's a relational approach to conflict. How do you preserve the relationship and engage in the conflict at the same time? A lot of us who are compassionate leaders are just like, you hear the trauma, you hear the story that kids tell you, and you're like, oh my gosh, like, how am I going to suspend this kid for 3 days because of all this stuff that he's telling me? There was hate speech, and there was like a pushing of a teacher, and there was like a swearing and turning over of death. Yeah, like those are things too. So we have to do both of these things. This is where the rub comes for restorative justice, which is, how do we do both of these things? How do we preserve relationship and actually build relationship while engaging in a conflict at the same time? That's the work, because the policy is engage in the conflict, do the thing, suspend the kid, detention, whatever it is, right? And versus sort of the other thing, which is be permissive, allow space for vulnerability, allow the empathy, which is really important. But if we don't do that, we build this culture of enabling. We build this culture where teachers don't feel safe, other kids don't feel safe. You hear from young people all the time when there's like violence or fighting in schools, I just don't feel safe here. I don't want to come to school here.
Yeah.
Right.
100%.
So we go back to that root cause of like, why aren't kids showing up? Right. Yeah. Let's sort that out.
Yeah.
So
I love that. I'm over on the National Center for Restorative Justice website. That's nationalcenterforrestorativejustice.com. And I'm looking at your upcoming trainings. You have one here in Seattle, middle of August 11th, 12th, 13th. One in Chicago, the first, PDX, which is Portland a couple times. You have a restorative schools conference. Can you talk a little bit about what people might find at that conference?
Yeah, June 26th and 27th, the Restorative Schools Conference. This is a big deal for us. This is going to be our first conference. Like big for us is 100, 150 people.
Sure.
We've got Marg Thornsberg from Australia coming. She's old school, like deep roots in sort of multiple books. But she recently, in partnership with Joe Brummer, who's out in Connecticut, wrote 2 books about a trauma-informed restorative educator, how to build trauma-informed schools, trauma-informed restorative justice schools.
Sure.
And so they're going to come to Portland and co-deliver some of their content about trauma in schools and restorative justice. We're going to have some Q&A and to do some pushing and hopefully like really challenge some ideas to really like help us grapple with them. And then we have a bunch of our consultants and our people that work with us who have deep roots in restorative justice and in schools. We'll be doing some sessions that folks will have options to engage with throughout the day. And it's just 2 days here in Portland. And we're really excited to be partnering with McMinimans, which is this really cool. It's a Kennedy school.
Okay.
The Kennedy school down there in Portland. So it's actually an old elementary school. So we'll be in the gymnasium. We've got these classrooms with old like chalkboards on the walls. So it feels very like school, but also very cool.
If you haven't been to a McMinimans, it's almost worth going just to be to one of them. They do such a great job with their spaces, and they restore a lot of old schools or hospitals, or they take old spaces and make them into beautiful conference centers and hotel rooms. That's great. That's great. That's where you're having it. That'll be great for people. I love it when we hold conferences in places that I feel like respect teachers. You know what I mean? A lot of times teachers end up in dingy old conference centers. And I'm just like, no, if you want to show respect to a teacher, we've got to have amazing conference centers where we take them to. And definitely McMinimans, I would say, fits that bill. Yeah, National Center for Restorative Justice.com. There are upcoming trainings in person. There's some virtual sessions as well that I'm looking at on the website here that probably you have those running throughout the school year, I'm going to guess, and people can sign up for those as they're needed. Such great work that you are doing. I really appreciate it. If people want to learn more, other than going to the website, which we'll have linked to in the show notes, if people want to learn more, where else should they go? Follow you on social or reach out?
Yeah, social is the best option. LinkedIn is actually the main place we hang out, but you can find us on Facebook as well. And then our website, and you can reach out through the website. Yeah.
Awesome. Nicholas, thank you so much for joining us today on the Shifting Schools podcast. And thank you for the work that you do in supporting educators across the United States and around the world in doing this work. It's important work. And I'm so excited that we get a chance to highlight it here at Shifting Schools. So thank you. Hey there, dedicated listener. If you've made it this far, we know you're passionate about shifting the way education works. And Tricia and I appreciate you. If you loved what you heard today, we'd be so grateful if you could take a moment to rate and review Shifting Schools wherever you listen to podcasts. Those ratings help us reach even more educators just like you. And if you know someone who could benefit from these conversations, please share this episode with them. Just one person. Think of the impact we can make together. Don't forget to sign up for our newsletter for even more great content. And if you haven't already, join us at Camp Shifting Schools, where the conversations keep going long after the podcasts end. Thank you for being a part of this journey, and thank you for being part of Shifting Schools.